I'm going to continue these lessons we're having on God's design for the home. Here's the latest one, God's design for the family, and we need to look at that. And one of the reasons we got so much trouble is because of trouble in the home. And some of these are dealing with sensitive topics. I know. Now, I have prayed that I can discuss these sensitive topics in this kind of audience with discretion. And so I may not be explicit in everything I say, but those of us that are mature are going to be able to read or hear and understand the things. The Bible is such a good guide on how to discuss sensitive subjects with discretion, because it is so plain and yet it is never degrading as it discusses these things. And so we're going to be discussing this lesson today. This is lesson 6. There are 8 of these, but how to deal with sexual temptation. I want you to look at that word temptation more than the word sexual. That's one kind of temptation, isn't it? There's many different kinds of temptations. And little children don't have to worry about that. And as the elderly get older, this isn't really a problem. There's a middle period of our lives where this can be a strong passion. And we've got to think about, how do we deal with this? Because if we let ourselves go and do like Paul said in Romans, walk after the flesh, we degrade and destroy ourselves. We're created in the image of God. We can walk after the Spirit. And we don't let animal passions dominate us. In fact, that's one of the freedoms that we have in Christ, that we can set ourselves above these passions. But yet there's a lot of temptations that come on strong. How do we cope with the various temptations? And throughout life, temptations remain. And so when we're thinking about this, don't just think of this kind of temptation. Let's think about temptations in more general and maybe look at this as an example of how we can overcome temptations and how we deal with temptations. Now, the Bible says in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. God made us with this passion in a righteous way to fulfill this, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. It's only within the confines of marriage that this is a blessing. And outside of marriage, succumbing to these passions for moments of pleasure become a curse to us. And so the Bible teaches us how to deal with it. I want you to look at James 1, 14 and 15. We see how this works. How we go from something that is a natural desire, and yet how it can turn into sin and death. That's what the devil does. He takes things that in and of themselves are not bad, but he can turn it into something to destroy you, and you can stop it. You don't have to let that happen. Now look at the progress that goes on here. This is in general about temptation. James 1, 14 and 15. Every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. There's the conception and the birth and the death. And so let's look at how this works. If we understand what's going on here, then we know how to intervene and prevent that death from occurring. Now, we start off with lust. The word translated lust here is simply a word desire. In fact, Jesus used this word in reference to himself when he said to the apostles, with desire have I desired to eat the Passover with you. The word itself is not a pejorative term. You have to look at the context to see whether a desire is a wholesome desire or has it turned into something evil. Now, desire is something that, well, that's part of God's plan for us. If we did not have desires, we could not survive. We would not know what we would need. And so our body craves certain things at certain times just for our physical survival. There's nothing wrong with the desire. But we discipline ourselves to know that when we have desires, we're going to stay on top of the desires and not let desires control us. And there is a line there. You see in those 6 points, the line, you can pass very easily and slip from a natural, wholesome, God-given desire and let that slip into something that is unwholesome. And that is when we're drawn away. Drawn away of that desire. What is it drawing you away from? A fleshly desire can draw you away from God. It can draw you away from God's teachings. It can draw you away from decency and goodness. It's not the desire, but it's allowing that desire to draw us away. What does it draw us away to? It draws us away to something that is evil and decrepit. That's what it does. And so, don't let the desire turn into something that will draw us away from what we ought to be. When it's drawn away, then we're enticed. That's another word for tempted. But see, you have let that desire get a hold, and you're allowing yourself to be drawn away from your desire, and you're setting yourself up. Now Satan knows, okay, I can tempt them now. He's gone that desire thing. Now I'll put the temptation out there and entice him. And then conceive. Do you know what that means? Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I've given in to that temptation. It's not that I have committed the act yet, but I've already decided I'm going to do that. I'm going to do it. All I need is the occasion and opportunity. It has been conceived, and then the sin. Now that's the sin of an act. There's sins in the heart that we allow when we allow ourselves to be drawn away. That's a sin in the heart. But now it's an act of sin. And what's the result? Death. Death. Spiritual death and separation from God. But quite often it can hasten our own death and the death of others as well, as we're going to see in this story. Well, now let's look at this. I know as a young man, this passage troubled me. I had trouble dealing with this. Matthew 5:27-28. You've heard it had been said by them of old, thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay, there's the act. But look, I say to you, whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. That's not whoso look on a woman. You know, men, we just find women attractive. Women, you're pretty. You're pretty. Men think that. And women probably think men, they're kind of handsome. You know, that's a natural thing. But there's one thing to look upon a woman and to look upon a woman to lust after her. See, that means you've been drawn away. Drawn away. That's the difference. Now, I'm going to talk about that just a little bit as we get into this story. We have a story that very closely follows what we read in James. And by seeing it in a story, I think it'll help us understand this. 2 Samuel chapter 11. And it came to pass, after a year was expired, at the time when kings went forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rahab, but David tarried still at Jerusalem. And it came to pass in an evening tide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman. And one said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned to her house. I saw what David planned to do when he got up off his bed and walked out that evening. What happened there? Let's look at this story and say, what could have done to divert this, to keep this from happening? Well, we're going to start here. David tarried at Jerusalem. Now, there may have been good reason. The Bible does not tell us why David tarried at Jerusalem. He sent Joab out to battle and didn't go himself. Now, there may have been a good reason for that, but may not have been. But whatever it was, one of the things we ought to take note of here, if we will stay busy at doing what we ought to do, we're not going to have time to think about things we shouldn't do. The things we shouldn't do, we just won't have time for it. There's so much we ought to be doing anyway. Let's make sure that we're spending our time and keeping our mind on that which is good and wholesome. Think on these things. So many times when we have leisure time, what do? Well, a lot of people use evil things to entertain them in their leisure time. Don't find evil things to entertain you. Find wholesome things. Find good things to entertain you in your leisure time. Not evil things. Those things play on your mind. And you say, "Oh, well, it doesn't bother me." I'll tell you, if you're to that point, it's already bothered you. It's already become a problem because your conscience has been seared and your heart's hardened. You remember when it bothered you? That's the way it should be, when it bothered you. And so, try to find things that David was tarrying at Jerusalem. And evidently, he wasn't busy enough doing what he ought to do, or he wouldn't have found time to gotten into this trouble that he was in. So that's one way we can prevent this. Make it part of our lifestyle to be busy about the right things. You know the old adage, the idle mind is a devil's workshop. So just don't let that opportunity come that way. But now let's look at this. It came to pass at eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. All right, again, that's innocent enough, isn't it? I bet every one of us have seen things we shouldn't have seen. And it's inadvertently. We weren't setting out to go look at something evil. Just we've heard something or we've seen something and we weren't really planning that. There it was. Okay. That creates enticement, doesn't it? There's a desire there that has been kindled. Now what do you do? Now, I want to say this about women. Ladies, it makes a difference how you appear. It wasn't just that he saw this woman washing herself. That wasn't good for David. And men, we need to think about this too, but the Bible puts the emphasis on women dressing modestly. It doesn't really say for men to dress modestly except by implication, but it's specific about women and how they appear. And so women, we need to think about this. Now, I enjoy the company of women, but I don't enjoy the company of women when they're not dressed well. They may not even realize they're not dressed well, but they should. And when that happens, I don't want my mind to go to evil things. I don't want that to happen. So that creates a tension. And I'm not a bad person. Men aren't just beasts out here that just can't help themselves. No, they can. But that creates a tension that makes me uncomfortable around women that aren't dressed appropriately. I'm uncomfortable. And I don't like dealing with that. It's not a comfortable thing for men to deal with. Now, women, some of you may know what I'm talking about. I can't speak for you, but you men know what I'm talking about, don't you? You don't want your mind to go there. And so you're not going to go there, but there's a tension that's been created that just makes it, and I don't really want to be around women that aren't dressed appropriately. I just don't want to be around them. And it's not because I'm evil, it's because it just makes me uncomfortable. But I enjoy the pleasure of the company of a good woman, a godly woman. It's not that's what's wrong. And so, what do you do? What do you do now? He saw her. What would you do? David, right then, here's what he should have done. See that picture? That picture's in that publication right there. Here's what he should have done right there. And just the whoop and go back in. And that would have stopped this right there, wouldn't it? Just don't look at it. It's one thing to see temptation. It's another thing to look at it. David shouldn't have been looking. Now, it doesn't take long. Just in a split second, you can tell this woman I shouldn't be seeing this, and walk away. But then say, wow, he not only saw it. It says, enter not into the path of the wicked, and go not in the way of evil men. Avoid it, pass not by it. Turn from it and pass away. That's what you do with things that are wrong. And look what it says about David. The woman was very beautiful to look upon. See, he doesn't just see her now, he's looking upon her. And he is admiring this. Drawn away. David, you just crossed the line. It's not that you saw her. You looked upon her. You're letting yourself be drawn away, David. And that's where you begin your fall. Now, Job 31 in verse 1. Learn from Job. He was a good man. I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? See, we're going to think about what we see. And so, men, decide with your eyes. I'm not going to look on that, because I'm not going to think about it. I've made a covenant with my eyes. I remember as a young man just having to look away. I'm just not going to look at that, because I didn't want to think on those things. And I knew if I looked upon it, not if I saw it, but if I looked upon it, it'd be in my mind. Look away. And then Proverbs 23, 31 through 32 talks about this in reference to another temptation. Look not upon the wine. It doesn't mean don't see it. It's not saying you don't ever see it. Don't look upon it. It's a desire. There's one thing to see something, and it's another to dwell on it and to look on it and say, oh boy, that looks good. Don't do that. So that's where David crossed the line right there. Now, he let himself be tempted. He gave into this. He sent and inquired after the woman. Why is he so interested in her? Who is that over there? And they told him it's the Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. See, he is allowing himself to be enticed. He's allowing himself to be tempted. And so he's gone that next step now. And then he sent messengers and took her. Why did he do that? Why did David send messengers and why did he take her? It's because lust had conceived. He'd already decided what he was going to do. He had not done it yet, but he'd already given in to the temptation. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get her over here. And so he sent messengers and took her. And then she came into him and he lay with her. There's the act of sin. You see, it started when he let himself be drawn away. That's where Christ says in the Sermon on the Mount, not to look upon a woman to lust after her in your heart. That's when you're drawn away. But now the sin has become the act. And then the consequences. She returned to her own house. But David, that's not over. I mean, you didn't get away with this. Wasn't long, she sends word to David, I'm with child. I'm with your child, David. David says, I've got to get Uriah home, make him think it's his child. He tried a couple of things and that didn't work. I'm going to have to kill Uriah. And Uriah, he had Uriah put to death out on the battle. He thought he had it all covered up. God came to Nathan the prophet and said, David, you're the man. And the child will die. And then David's house was filled from this time forward with turmoil from his own children. They learned from their father, and they didn't control themselves. They allowed themselves to be drawn away. It wasn't over. There was a lot of death that came out of this. And so there's the process. Lust, drawn away, enticed, conceived, sin, and death. Just don't go down that road. Don't go down. The line's way up here. The desire, that's where you stop it. And you don't let yourself be drawn away with that desire. Now, we've got to talk about Bathsheba. Now, Bathsheba is the victim here. And I don't want anyone to think other than that, but that doesn't mean she's totally innocent either. Now, sure, David's the king. He can tell people to come and go, and he's in charge of things. And Bathsheba's probably caught off guard here, and things had happened before she thought, but she's not totally innocent either. Listen, she was washing herself up on the roof. Now, that's kind of like, that's where you wash yourself. That's what roofs were for, things like that. And she maybe thought, well, if anybody sees me, they ought to look away. They shouldn't do that. And that's true. But she could also have used some discretion, shouldn't she? Ladies, there are things you can do that are innocent, but maybe you need to use a little discretion. Use some discretion. There's probably a way to bathe where you aren't so visible. And if you're going to get up on your roof and take a bath, why don't you wait till it's dark? You could do that, so people don't see you. And maybe maybe it was all innocent, but maybe probably she wasn't thinking about what that would be out there. Because I tell you, men see things and it bothers men. So use some discretion. Realize that. It does not excuse a man, but still discretion can be a benefit, a help. With Bathsheba here. That's not all she did, though. She came to him. David sent for her, and she came to him. Now listen, here's the lesson to learn. Ladies, if you're ever on your roof taking a bath, and when you get through, the king calls and says, I want you to come over here. Don't go. Don't go. That's just, all right. And you think, well, that's not going to happen. But things like that happen, don't they? Just be wise and don't go. And if you do need to go over there, he's the king. Okay, take someone with you. Why would she think the king would call her that evening? She was right out there where he could have seen her, and she went over there. That wasn't a very smart thing to do. So, if a man is trying to get you over to him alone, let that be a red flag. Have someone with you when you go see a man or visit a man. Men, have someone with you when you go see a woman. And just use some discretion here. Just think, if Bathsheba had said to her neighbor, a good friend of hers, the king's called me, would you go with me over? It could have changed everything right there. I mean, it could have just changed everything. So again, we're not talking about something necessarily wrong, but indiscreet. Use some discretion. Now here it is. He lay with her. Now maybe he forced her. But the Bible does speak of this. This was done in Jerusalem. Here's what the Bible says in Deuteronomy 22 through 24. If a man be found lying with a woman married to a husband, and then they both of them die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman, so thou shalt put evil away from Israel. If a damsel that is a virgin be betrothed to a husband, and a man find her in the city, and lie with her, then you shall bring them both to the gate of the city, and you shall stone them with stones that they die. The damsel, here it is, because she cried not, being in the city. And the man, because he hath humbled his neighbor's wife, so thou shalt put evil away from you. It goes on to say, now if this is out in the field and there's no one around to hear her cry and she is forced, that's a different story. But she was in the city. So, well, now, you might try to get, but Bathsheba, she was in a tough spot. Let me tell you what, Joseph was in a tough spot, wasn't he? When he fled from Pharaoh's wife, that was a tough spot. And he wound up being chained in prison. Resist the evil. That's what you do. There's no indication that she yelled out. And if she had, would David have gone through with this? Probably not. She needed to go back and study this Deuteronomy and then have the courage to resist. Women aren't victims of this. Men are in control of their thoughts. They can't blame the woman for what she is doing, for what the man does, but the woman is in control of herself too, and she can resist. But then this, it really bothers me about Bathsheba. When it says she returned to her house, you remember how David thought he had a way to cover this up with Uriah coming home? That wouldn't have worked unless she was cooperating with it. She was going to be part of the cover-up. Now, she was not totally innocent in this. The bulk of the guilt certainly falls on David, but she could have done some things too to prevent this from turning out like it did. Now, ladies, I need some help. Because there's some things that a preacher from a pulpit can't handle very well. In Titus chapter 2, Paul tells Titus, I want you to teach. Titus, go teach the aged men. Titus, you go teach the aged women. Titus, this is something you need to teach the young men. What about the young women? Titus, here's what you need to do when it comes to young women. Let the aged women teach the young women. See, there are some things that a preacher, a young preacher, or even an old preacher, he just can't do very well. And older women can do this much better. And so we need some older women that will get beyond their comfort zone. You think it's not very, it's kind of hard to do this. How do you go tell a young woman she's not dressed right, she's not behaving herself right? Listen, let me tell you, young mother, about what your daughter's doing. How do you do that? It's very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable for me right now. And it's the older women that Paul said, Titus, tell the older women, they're the ones that can teach these younger women. They'll do a better job teaching them than you would. One of the reasons I'm uncomfortable is because I've tried to teach on these things before, and I remember some of the things I was accused of because I was teaching these things. And I don't teach this because I have a dirty mind. Don't accuse me. This is what the Bible teaches. But yet there's some things that older women can teach younger women much more effectively and much better than the preacher can. And so we need some older women to do this. And you older women, I tell you, older women, you need to develop the spiritual maturity and become skilled in this and realize I've got a responsibility to younger women. And I'm going to fulfill that. I'm going to prepare myself and do that because they need me. I wish someone had taught me, and they need me. So, there's the lesson. Let's go back to the heart. James 1, 22 through 23. Wherefore, laying apart all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness, receive with meekness the engrafted word, which is able to save your souls. That's receiving it into the heart. And then be ye doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. If you just hear it and don't do it, you're deceiving yourself. That's like the foolish man that heard and obeyed not. He built his house on the sand. James is talking about that. We started in James when we were talking about this process here. Now we're ending in James. What's the cure? The cure is to receive with meekness the engrafted word, which is able to save your souls, and then be a doer of it. And so I'm going to offer the invitation. You receive the word? Are you ready to do it? Be baptized into Christ. Come out of that water and let the teachings of Christ bring you to that maturity to which Christ aspires for us. If you're ready, come forward as we stand and sing.